napisan na anglo-norman literature kontekst, znači odnosi se pre svega na, u stvari, anglo-normanski period. Nadam se da vidite, nadam se da me čujete, pretpostavljam da je, ako postoji neki problem, da biste mi se javili do sada. I assume that, thank you. I hope that you can see the presentation as well. So today we'll be discussing the context. So we will be talking about history and the major events from that history. Anglo-Norman period lasts from 1066, which is the Battle of Hastings. So it begins with the Battle of Hastings, and then it ends with another battle, the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, when the Tudors entered the political scene in England. So it is, again, just like Anglo-Saxon literature, it is a long period, and I have selected just a few of these dominant trends and tendencies and events which mark it and which are relevant actually for our understanding of the text that we will be discussing later on. So this is the outline of the lecture. I'll cover very briefly sociopolitical and economic history, including the conquest, including the feudalism, the end of feudalism, the beginnings of capitalism, the Crusades, the Black Death, and of course the Great Uprising in 1381. So as for the conquest, or the conquest, the Anglo-Saxon period ends in 1066, when England was once more invaded and once more conquered by Germanic tribes, by Germanic people. They were called the Normans, which is the corrupt version of Norsemen. This should be familiar to you because I have actually based this particular part of the lecture, the greater part of the lecture, on the British Studies course book. So perhaps if you have already covered the 13th, 14th century and so on, you will be familiar with these ideas and with these facts. So Germanic people were called Normans. Actually, they came from France, but they were originally actually from the north, and it is a corruption of the word Norseman. And they were the descendants of the Scandinavian adventurers who seized the wide part of northern France. So actually, when King Alfred diverted the Vikings, the Danes, Scandinavians from England, they settled in the north of France. And Normandy, in the period when it's attacked England, it was a powerful state, and their duke was meant to be subjected to the King of France, but in reality, it was an independent political entity. You know that the political history and the social history of the medieval period is quite complicated, and that kings needed constantly the support of the church in order to, which was not easily gained, in order to maintain their power. And one of the threats to their power were these independent estates, were these independent dukes and aristocrats and so on. In theory, in the theory of three states celebrated by Alfred, for instance, you remember that, they are meant to live in unity, in harmony and so on. Everybody, each state has its tasks and so on, but in proper history it was messier, and this is a good example actually how the Duke was meant to be subjected. However, it was an independent political entity, so their Duke ultimately became the King of England. So what happened? Normandy, as I said, originated in King Alfred's time, so the 9th century, when he diverted the Danish invaders to northern France, and they settled there, accepted Christianity, French language, and so on. However, they still wanted to conquer, to rule England. And when in England Edward the Confessor died in 1066, there were famously three pretenders to the throne. One was William of Normandy, who was of royal but not native blood, so he's that Frenchman, Norseman. Harold, Earl of Wessex, who was not royal but who had native blood, so he was an Englishman. And finally, Harold Hardrada, who was the king of Norway, a famous Viking warrior. So what happened is that Britain chose Harold, Earl of Wessex, so they chose their own man, somebody from that country. They chose him over the strangers. However, William, who was at that moment just the Duke of Normandy, he's known as William the Conqueror, and also he had another nickname, William the Bastard. because of his illegitimate birth. So he had an army ready. He sailed for Britain. And unfortunately, Harold was already fighting in the north. He was fighting Hardala's army. So Harold was actually attacked by two other pretenders to the throne. And he hurried back, but after the march, his army was tired, his soldiers were tired, and they could not fight Norman cavalry. That is even worse, because the Normans were on horses, and Harold's army, they were common soldiers. They went there on foot. And there is also the anecdote that Harold's soldiers had only soup for dinner, and that William of Normandy's army had roast beef, and they were therefore well fed and full of energy and fought energetically and won the victory over Harold's army. So Harold was killed. At that moment, he was the king because he was chosen by Witten. So he was killed, and William was crowned very soon on Christmas Day. So this is October 14th, 1066. On Christmas Day, he was crowned king in 1066, and this marks the Anglo-Saxon period in English history, and it also marks the Old English, the period of Old English literature, in more specifically in literary history. And this is just one example, one illustration of this famous battle. And as you can see, this is Harold who is killed. There is already somebody who is presenting the helmet as a sign of accepting defeat and so on. And this is William of Normandy. They were cavalry, so they were on horses. William of Normandy, who will become the new king. However, interestingly enough, so when they lived in Normandy, these dukes and these politicians, they were very much invested in the idea of conquering England. But once they secured England, they were actually not that interested in it, primarily because they were constantly fighting the Welsh, the Scots, and their own barons. So if you remember, I've just given you an example. Harold himself acted independently from the King of France. Now in England, he also, in order to maintain his rule over England, he constantly had to fight his own barons. In addition to all these problematic Celts and so on, he had to fight his own barons for the control of it. And actually the first 7 English kings, some of them who are heavily mythologized, but the first 7 English kings were known as absentee rulers, and they are known nowadays as absentee rulers, meaning they did not spend a lot of time in England. So the most famous example and the most shocking example is Richard I, or the Lionheart. He is heavily mythologized, but I think that he spent only like a couple of months in England for all the time of his rule. And England became the principal concern of their kings only in the 13th century with Henry III. As for literature and language, because that is what we are interested in, very little survived between the conquest and the beginning of the 13th century. Before the Norman conquest, you remember that different Germanic tribes spoke various dialects, and they pushed the Celts out of the lowlands. That's why the Celts inhabit the mountains, the hills of Scotland and of Wales and so on. So they were pushed, and one of the results of the many results, one of the results was that very few Celtic words were actually adopted by Angles and Saxons, and that's why you do not have in the English language nowadays, you do not have very many Celtic words. You have Latin words, that is the legacy, of course, of the Romans. The suffixes, prefixes mainly. You have, of course, Germanic sounding words, and you also have French sounding words, because all these contributed to the creation of the modern English, and they all testify to the waves of invaders and waves of socio-political and necessarily cultural changes that went with them. So when the Normans conquered the country, French became the official language of law, of education, and of course, you already know that Latin was always circulating. Latin was lingua franca. I mean, I'm even using I'm even using the Latin term lingua franca of the continent, because the continent was united by the church primarily. It was the official language of the church, so Latin was the universal language. A new language introduced to the British Isles was, of course, French, because that was the language of nobility, the language that also entered professional spheres, education, law, and so on. And it was the only language that was, of course, spoken by the ruling class, because William of Normandy, William the Conqueror, brought, after killing Harold, he brought his own aristocracy, he brought his own noblemen who all spoke French. This does not mean that the English language was forgotten. English language was also in circulation, it was also used, but it was used by the lower classes. It was used by peasants, by herdsmen, for a few centuries. No comprehensive grammar book was created, no comprehensive grammar was installed, so it was a very economic language, and it was preferred by these poorer people. In a way, it was a very effective means of communication, and it only became the official language of the court, pay attention, at the height of the 100 Years' War, which took place between the 14th and the 15th century. So very late, and nowadays, I mean, it's very confusing, shocking even to learn that, because nowadays, of course, it is English that is lingua franca. It is English that is the universal language, at least for now. Maybe it will be Chinese soon, who knows. But it was, and this is the form of language, this is the form of English, this particular English that was proclaimed the official language of the court between the 14th and the 15th century. It is the form of English known as Middle English. And it is the creation of this Middle English was attributed to, and is attributed to, Chaucer and Wycliffe. Chaucer, who is known in literary history as the father of the English language, so that is what he is famous for, not necessarily as a great literary figure, although of course he was a very skillful writer. We'll talk about him. That is the last, actually, lesson in this course, so we'll talk about him in January. And also Wycliffe. It familiarized people, this Middle English familiarized people with plenty of French and Latin words, and they became part and parcel of English vocabulary, as Professor Vesna Lopacic states in her her history of Introduction to British Studies. So aristocracy and educated people ultimately followed the trend. The English language became the most precious of English cultural treasures. That's one way of seeing it. Another way of seeing it is to see it simply as the instrument, additional instrument of colonization, which inevitably spread with the creation of the British Empire and British imperialist tendencies and imperialist ambitions. They were already tested in the Crusades as early as the first 3 centuries of the second millennium, the 11th, 12th, and the 13th century. So the first language needed to be stabilized a bit after a very turbulent period, in political terms, in social terms, in terms of economy, and so on. And then finally, written English literature begins to reappear at the end of the 12th century. So pay attention, it is written English literature. This does not mean, despite the turbulence of times, it does not mean that from 1066 until the end of the 12th century, there is no literature, there is no consumption of narratives, there is no production of stories, and so on. It simply means that they were not written down. There were popular oral ballads, there were popular fairy tales, folk tales, and so on, other forms. Written literature begins to reappear only at the end of the 12th century, and it is a very different kind of literature, as you're going to see. So Old English literature is grave, it is serious, it discusses serious issues. I mean, after all, the dominant forms are the epic and elegies, and you are by now familiar with some of the characteristics of the epics and the elegies. The voice uttering the poems, the speaker in the poems in these epics, the speaker is always male, he's always of the higher position, he's always serious, he always discusses things that are relevant to the most important sections of society, like king or chieftain and his men, and so on and so forth. Now we have the literature that is uttered by a variety of voices, and we even get to hear, as this period progresses, we even get to hear female voices. We get the wife of Bath from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, who is considered to be the first feminist in English literature, and so on and so forth. And so we have a variety of voices, and we necessarily have a variety of subjects, a variety of topics. It is really different in terms of voices, in terms of style, in terms of subject matter. This new literature, Anglo-Norman literature, later on it will be Middle English literature, it is really different in terms of atmosphere as well. However, so on the one hand, you have this positive development. On the other hand, this is especially this transitionary literature before big names such as the Gawain poet or Chaucer arrive. This is the kind of literature that misses originality of thought, and basically you have writers who address audience, address popular audience. So it's not only the kind of literature that is meant to solidify social relations and that is meant to be recited in courts after serious battles and so on. So the scope of the audience is also widened, and because the writers needed to be liked by popular audience, this kind of literature is characterized by greater immediacy. Another very conspicuous change, another very conspicuous transformation is the transformation of a hero. So now you do not get Beowulf, you do not get those broken, lonely warriors who voice elegies. What you see as a hero is now a common man, and the subject matter is often love, which is, if you remember, it is not something that you find in Old English literature. You do not find love, especially heterosexual love between a man and a woman. You do not see it as treated as valuable or worthy of consideration in Old English literature. So women, of course, they are finally included, but even when they're included in those again, early examples in that transitional period, they're more of stereotypes than proper fully fledged characters. So there are stereotypes in romances, in love lyrics. You also have a very strong anti-feminist satire, which is derived from monasticism. So the Catholic Church is still very strong. It is still very powerful. So struggles of women that appear occasionally, their voices and so on, they are also countered by these anti-feminist satires. And as I said, we get finally in the 14th century in Canterbury Tales the first feminist character in English literature, that is Wife of Bath, and we'll be reading, you'll be reading it with me, Wife of Bath's Tale, again in January, so next year. Now, as for the Anglo-Norman period, so this is just a very brief outline of the changes, primarily in terms of language and of literature. Now, to be a bit more detailed and to highlight, I want to highlight certain events and certain tendencies and trends of this period. So it is the period that lasts from 1066, from the Battle of Hastings, until the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. The key characteristics of this period in terms of society, in terms of social organization and economy, and necessarily culture, the key tendencies are feudalism and the beginning of capitalism. So of course it is not only the church that is still going strong, but also feudalism. Then we have the Crusades, the Black Death, as the pandemic of unimaginable, devastating consequences. And finally, I want to talk about the Great Uprising of 1385. So as for feudalism, I'll just remind you briefly that feudalism was already present. It had already been present when Duke of Normandy, William the Conqueror, when he attacked, when he landed and attacked and killed Harold and so on. By that time, feudalism had already been operating in operation for several centuries in England. The Duke of Normandy, and now King of England, basically he inherited the infrastructure, he inherited the system. He himself came from the similar social structure, so he didn't feel the need to change it. So he simply replaced the old nobility with his Norman supporters. He killed the Anglo-Saxon or native aristocracy. He killed native clergy, dispossessed them, and so on. Killed common people, but that's about it. He then replaced and kept on ruling, so that there were no huge or significant in any way social changes or challenges to the system. He simply replaced, eliminated the actors, he eliminated those who participated, brought his own people, but the structure remained intact. It did not change. And he also ordered, he was very much interested in land as his possession and as the source of power. So he ordered the making of the famous Doomsday Book, which is the only economic survey in Europe. Nobody else in Europe was doing that. The only economic survey in Europe which provided modern readers and modern researchers with great details about the 11th century England. And what you get from the Doomsday Book is actually, the basic characteristics of feudalism, and you are already familiar with them, hopefully. So England had already been divided into large estates. Now they were held mostly by Norman lords, by Norman aristocrats. Unsurprisingly, because this is feudalism, religiously backed feudalism, the king is the owner of all land, and he rules fulfilling God's wish. And all the other noblemen are his tenants, fundamentally, despite their power, despite their wealth and so on. They are basically king's tenants, and they are expected to be obedient and to serve the king whenever he asks them. Usually that was, you remember that as well, that was military service. Now this was replicated, this kind of relationship was replicated down the social ladder to the lowest serf, who was simply tilling the land, working on the land in order to stay alive. This was meant to provide coherence, this was meant to provide unity, because it was one and the same relationship that was replicated among the classes, among the people. But in reality, of course, there was much tension and much hatred. So the king fought with, and historically, kings fought with the representatives of the church, and kings fought their own barons. And you will see later how the king, for instance, how the kings gave charters of freedom to medieval cities in order to create them as some kind of base for his power and for his authority, rather than the authority of the nobleman or aristocrat in the area in which the town was situated. So the king gives charter of freedom to a town, and the town then is some kind of represents some kind of support for the king, rather than the nobleman in whose area it is located. This also is an illustration, an example of how kings try to maintain their power against the aggressive noblemen, against the aggressive aristocrats, and so on. And then, of course, you also have tension between the lower classes and the higher classes, and it will explode in the peasant revolt of 1381, when the king's treasurer will be beheaded by the group of angry peasants and angry town people, citizens. So it was, as I said, it was meant to promote interdependence and so on, but in reality there was a lot of tension. The king was still the person with the highest authority. His major tenants were in the council, which was a body that was helping the king rule the country. And they also acted, if you remember the darkest part of the Middle Ages, they also acted as judges for their own tenants, and this is known as manorial jurisdiction. So there was no universal law. That will be changed, of course, with the passage of time. And this is hierarchy that is based on land ownership, reinforced by the legal system. As I already stated, it was actually, the actual history was the history of conflict rather than cohesion. The good example is the murder of Thomas Becket, when Henry II was forced to do penance for this murder. If you remember Henry II, it is still not clear whether he really gave the order, who will rid me of this troublesome priest, whether he really gave the order to have Thomas Becket murdered or not. However, he as the king was forced to do penance by the religious authority, by the church leaders. And this is a great example of this ongoing dispute and the constant shifting of power from the church to the king and vice versa. So there are moments when the church is stronger, there are moments when the king is stronger. It all ended with Henry VIII, who simply broke up with the Roman church and became a statesman, the leader of the land, and also created his own church, the Anglican Church. So he did not have anybody to answer to but himself. He was at the same time the highest church authority and at the same time the highest authority in the state. But we are talking about Middle English, and we're talking about Anglo-Norman period, so it is yet to come, it is yet to happen. And of course, as for the lower classes, I already mentioned you have this really bloody English uprising or peasant revolt in 1381, and you also have very interesting responses to it. John Gower, for instance, he's next to William Langland. He's considered to be one of the greatest satirists and one of the greatest critics of this period of the 14th century. His nickname was Moral Gower, but even this moral person wrote Vox Clamantis, where he actually sided with his class, and he was educated. He wrote, he had free time to write, therefore he didn't have to work. So obviously he was belonged to a higher class, and he wrote Vox Clamantis, the voice of one crying in wilderness, which is a direct allusion to the Bible. He sided against the rebels, and he was actually horrified by their behavior, comparing them to wild animals, and so on. So those are the characteristics of feudalism. So you have the three states, you have the supposed cohesion, they're meant to be in unity. The reality is the reality of constant friction and of constant tension between king and the church, between king and the nobility, between higher and lower classes, and so on. And the key thing in feudalism is, of course, the ownership of the land, where all of the land is in king's hands and everybody else is just a tenant. So the nobleman is a tenant, and then the serfs living on that land, tilling the land, producing food, and so on, they're also the tenants. They're the tenants of the nobleman, and so on and so forth. The ownership of the land is only in the hands of the king. And that's the difference, according to Foucault, for instance, that's the difference between pre-modern power and modern power, because pre-modern power, medieval power, is all about the land. It's all about the possession of the land, whereas modern power, according to Foucault, is all about people and populations. And that's why you have so many interventions meant to improve the general population, improve their health, improve their life, and so on. And of course, that ended at the end of the 20th century. And now in the 21st century, I honestly don't know. Maybe the power is in Bitcoin or something like that. Who knows? Anyway, so those are the characteristics of feudalism. But this true feudalism basically ends with King Stephen already in the 12th century. And from the 12th century onwards, we actually have more and more of the challenges to feudalism that point to the future formation of a new system, and that system will be, of course, the capitalist one, or simply capitalism. And one of the challenges to feudalism and to the power of the king is to be found in Magna Carta Libertatum. Je li vam poznato ovo ste radili sad? Vi sad u stvari radite sa Sanjom?
Da, radili smo.
Ok. Znači ovo je sad samo kao nekakav maltene nije review, nego kako se to kaže, obnavljanje. Pa da, obnavljamo gradivo. So there were legal challenges, of course economic challenges, political. They're never easily separated, or they're inseparable actually to begin with. But when it comes to legal challenges, the first legal, or one of the most conspicuous, one of the most far-fetching consequences, is of course the signing of Magna Carta Libertatum in the field outside London in 1215 by John Lackland, who was Richard Lionheart's brother. And this was, there is a prehistory that led to John signing this document. And this prehistory includes the failures associated with his reign. So he lost lands in France. He entered into conflict with the Pope. If you remember, that the totality of the English nation was, well, not really excommunicated, but there were no religious rights for some years in England because of his conflict with the Pope. And all these failures ultimately coerced John into signing this document called Great Charter of Freedoms in 1215, and nowadays it is interpreted as the cornerstone of political freedom. But as always, when historical things are happening, people are not necessarily aware or fully aware of the implications. So King John himself did not take it seriously. And when it was signed, it was not some kind of magical document that solved all the problems for the totality of population. It still did not bring any kind of help, any kind of relief to the majority of the people. The key thing was that it provided noblemen with more independence from the king. So this document, actually, you have the king signing the document, which limits his feudal rights. Can you imagine how progressive that is in the 13th century, 1215? Do we have that today? So this is a 19th century rendition. This is how the Victorians imagined the signing of Magna Carta. However, with the passage of time, the implications they proved to be far-fetching and numerous. And basically, according to some interpreters, it helped to undermine the whole feudal system by weakening that major element of the feudal system, and that is the link between the king and his followers. And you remember that link was insisted upon even in the Germanic tribes, the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, even before they conquered and settled England or the British Isles in the 5th century. So even before that, you had chieftain, you had the leader of the comitatus, you had his men. The key thing was that the men were tied to the king by the bonds of loyalty, and the king responded by providing gold, providing armor, providing horses, and so on. Of course, with feudalism, when they live in settled environment, the king provides the land, gives the land, rents the land, and so on. But that basic relationship is still the same. And that is the key relationship, not the relationship between the husband and wife, father and children, mother and children, and so on. The key relationship is between the leader and his men. And when you sign this particular document, I mean, you really have to think that eventually it will, because it simply gives barons more independence. So it seems that they had profited the most from this particular document. However, combined with the appearance of the merchant and artisan class, this document all stimulated ultimately all kinds of social changes. There was growing social fluctuation also due to Henry II's primogeniture law. Primogeniture law means that the totality of the estate goes to the firstborn son, which means that, and it's medieval period. Perhaps there's definitely no contraception per se, or a successful one. So the people had more children, more sons, and now you have two outcomes of Henry II's primogeniture law. One is that, of course, if all the land goes to the hands of one man, and if that man then marries somebody else with the equal estate, and people of the same class, then you have the appearance of large estates, which represents the germ of capital accumulation. And you also have a new class of dispossessed sons. You have a new class of people who do not have any money, any inheritance. The young men left without property, and they then go to trade, navy, crafts, arts, church, or adventure, providing this social fluctuation because they move beyond their own class, beyond their immediate class. They go either below, most often they go below their own class, or on rare occasions they might rise, but they're no longer They are no longer the leaders and the owners of the estate. And they also added to the number of the city dwellers and intensified social mobility in general. And Magna Carta also gave impetus to the lowest social classes who started venturing into the world, taking taking their chances, exploring, and they mostly moved into cities and to newly created jobs. And there's also so in a way this limiting of the king's power had positive effects in terms of greater social mobility, although it is not all this social mobility is not to be attributed exclusively to Magna Carta Libertatum. And there's Article 39 from Magna Carta Libertatum, which details the treatment of free men, from which the idea of human rights and human freedoms actually emerged. And the outcome ultimately was that even the king was subject to the law, which again, it sounds so beautiful and so lovely. And you have to think about whether we have really moved in the 21st century, whether we have moved onward, or do we need to regress to 1215, where even the king is the subject of the law? So ultimately the arbitrariness, this unlimited power, the despotism, it's known as despotism, they were curbed. And also you have Article 39. Please pay attention. They're talking about, it's 1215. So they're talking about free men. It is not only free men who live in England. It is not only free men who live in Europe. We still have, it is still feudalism, and we still have unfree population. We still have serfdom. So bear that in mind. This article, even though it should be greeted as the germ from which the idea of human freedoms emerges, it should not be seen as some kind of ideal document that covers all sections of the population. It does not take into consideration the serfs. It does not take into consideration unfree population. They still had no rights. In that sense, it is very similar to the much later document, and that is, of course, the Declaration of Independence, that talks about people who have the right to life, liberty in the pursuit of happiness, and the people who are drafting and signing this document are slave owners. So obviously it does not include to slaves. So in Article 39, it is stated that no free man shall be seized or imprisoned, or stripped of his rights or possessions, or outlawed or exiled, or deprived of his standing in any other way, nor will we proceed with force against him or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. So it limits the brutality, it limits, police brutality, although of course there was no police in the modern sense of the word at that time in England. It also this article requires all the proceedings against someone to be according to the law. And again, as I say, it is a lovely article, it is a lovely document, but we shouldn't overestimate how liberating it was. We shouldn't overestimate how progressive it was, because it not only discusses free men exclusively at the price of forgetting the serfdom, unfree population. It also discusses free men. It does not take into consideration women, and so on. Still, for 1215, it is quite impressive. And gradually, from that document, you also have the creation of the parliament, the common law, and constitution. They all begin from the idea that nobody is above the law, and from that you have, for instance, representation, which is to be found in the English parliament, the common law, constitution. So in the 13th century, this was a well-ordered, lawful country, or so some people state. And Magna Carta then marks the decline of feudalism by initiating not only legal changes, but also initiating social changes and economic ones as well. Another way in which feudalism was challenged was, and ironically, it was meant to reinforce the king's power, but ultimately it led to the challenge. It represented one additional challenge to feudalism. one way in which it was challenged was through medieval towns. So the kings, as I said, gave charters of freedom to the towns, and they freed the inhabitants from feudal duties to the local lord. Znači vidite koliko je to moćna stvar, koliko je to politički moćna stvar. Znači kralj koji ima vrhunsku vlast, ako želi da kazni recimo nekog ili želi da mu oduzme prosto deo novca, da prosto taj njegov nobleman ne bude tako ekonomski jak, kralj da povelju slobode gradu koji je trebalo bi da bude pod vlašću tog noblemana. I sad kralj da povelju slobode i onda građani u stvari ne plaćaju porez, ne plaćaju nikakve dažbine, nikakav novac ne daju. They don't give any kind of money to the local noblemen. They do not necessarily pay taxes to the king. They pay for the charters of freedom. The charters of freedom cost a lot of money. But now people living within the walls of the city, within the walls of medieval towns, they are free. And these medieval towns were meant to be centers of royal authority to balance or to curb the power of local nobility. But the towns in reality were quite independent. They were independent both from the nobleman and from the king. So they could raise their own taxes, they could have their own courts. I mean, it is still important to bear in mind this legal aspect. And inside the town walls was the social and economic organization that was free from feudal rule. And that represents the birth of the middle class and actually capitalist economy, because you had artisan classes, you had craftsmen, you had merchants, and so on. And that will ultimately, of course, when I say this will be at some point the birth of capitalism and so on, you have already in medieval towns, you have the social infrastructure, you have the social organization, the class that will later become the middle class, and so on. What is missing is actually the Industrial Revolution. With the Industrial Revolution, so you need the technological actually basis. With the Industrial Revolution and this kind of infrastructure, social infrastructure that is already present in towns, it is only then that capitalism will properly appear, will properly come into being, and that will be, of course, the second half of the 18th and the first few decades of the 19th century in Great Britain. Great Britain, by that time, of course, it is Great Britain. Great Britain was the first country in the world that started the Industrial Revolution. They finished it the first, so it was completed much earlier than in the other European countries, and that's how they were able to create their empire to rule 3/4 of the world approximately, and so on, at the great human cost, at the great cost of the environment, at the great cost of animals and so on. So it was horrific for the majority of the population. However, to the rest of the world, they looked progressive and wealthy and so on, and they were several percent of the population were. Now, another aspect of this particular period, another feature, and it is closely related to the text that we'll be reading. So again, I'm introducing it because of that primarily. Those are the Crusades. So the Crusades lasted from 1095 to 1365, or basically not the 11th, the 12th, the 13th, and the 14th century. And why do we have to discuss the Crusades? We can discuss them simply as medieval imperialist wars, but they were not only that, they also testify to the power of the church. We keep forgetting, I mean, I keep reminding you, but we tend to forget because we simply hopefully live in a different period. Hopefully, when the church is not as powerful as it was. It is still powerful, it is still very influential, not as powerful as it was in the medieval times. So the reason why we discuss the Crusades is basically as a testimony to this power of the church. And as one critic said, always bear this in mind, that the main difference, one of the main differences between the order of medieval and the order of modern society is the preeminent role played in the former, meaning played in the medieval society, by the church and its many institutions. So the Crusades were actually religious wars or holy wars. Christians are always afraid of other religions and their holy wars. And of course, I'm certainly not defending any kind of holy war. And in that spirit, of course, I cannot defend the Christian ones. But basically, the pretext was for all of these wars. The pretext was to liberate Christ's tomb from the so-called infidels in Jerusalem in the Middle East. In reality, it was again all about power. It was all about politics. It was all about Roman Catholic Church attempting to gain supremacy over Christian Orthodox Church. They parted ways very early in 1054, when, if you remember, the church was split and there were two church centers. One was Rome, one was Byzantium or Constantinople. When Byzantium was attacked by the Turks, it was in 1095, Pope saw the opportunity to secure the dominance of the Roman Catholic Church by mobilizing the nobility, by mobilizing the army, and so on, and sending them to fight for the tomb of Christ against the infidels. And they were holy wars because their fighters were distinguished by the red cross or a cross, always worn on their chest, always worn on their shields and so on. Just look at that. This is supposed to be a Christian knight. And it is a contradictio in terminis, to borrow Latin terms. So he's a Christian, and he has his sword raised in order to slaughter someone, in order to therefore behave like a proper Christian. And this is the embodiment, another embodiment of the chivalrous Christian knight. This is the portrait of Richard I. Again, pay attention, Richard Lionheart, pay attention to the cross that he is also wearing. And on Thursday, we will meet and we will read twin accounts of the siege and the taking, actually, of Jerusalem, one from the perspective of a Christian person, William of Tyre, and another from the perspective of the Muslim author Ibn al-Athir, who wrote Perfect History. And you will see how merciless the Christians were. And unless you think that it is some kind of propaganda by Ibn al-Athir, you actually see the same thing in William of Tyre, A History of Deeds Done Beyond the Sea, where he admits to killing men, women, and children, and looting and plundering, and so on. And he says, well, we did all of that in Christ's name. He would be proud, and so on. So it's very funny. I mean, it was not funny for the people who actually experienced it, but it is. We'll discuss that on Thursday. Crusades, however, they did not only liberate or attempt to liberate Christ's tomb from the infidels. The Crusades were also about persecuting heathens, persecuting heretics, persecuting everybody who was the other. And there were 8 wars, 8 holy wars, marking the first 3 centuries of the second millennium. One of these wars was the so-called Children's Crusade, which was supposed to have happened in 1212. It is the status is still ambiguous, and there's some evidence that it happened, some evidence that it was more fiction. But the idea is that children were sent to liberate with their childish innocence, with their childish purity. They were gathered and sent from Europe to liberate Christ's tomb. And as you can imagine, many of them died, many of them were captured and sold into slavery. England did not play a major role in the Crusades, although there were representatives which are worth mentioning, such as Richard the Lionheart, who was an absentee king, and he spent most of his time actually away fighting, and that's how he earned this nickname Lionheart. He participated in the 12th century, 1190, Henry III in 1250. And he returned home financially embarrassed. And the worst example is, of course, Edward I, who was generally a cruel and merciless man. And he's got the nickname the greatest lance in the world. Možete zamislite. Znači, dobio je nadimak posle tih učestvovanja. On je 4 godine ratovao. Znači, prosto ne znam kako to da da opišem. To je kao kad idete u lov, pa ste vi sad opremljeni, imate čopor pasa, imate najmodernije oružje, na konjima ste, i onda jurite one jadne lisice koje su potpuno, znači, male, gladne i preplašene. Onda vi jurite i onda dobijate takav neki, to su bili Crusades, znači praktično vi ubijate narod. I on je dobio nadimak najbolje sečivo, je tako, najveće sečivo na svetu. I imao je homosexual son Edvarda II, o kome su mnogi pisali. Tako da to mu dođe nekako neki poetic justice, možda. These were actually all ultimately, so they served the function of securing the position of the Roman Catholic Church, especially in relation to the Orthodox Church. They served the function of persecuting heretics, heathens, basically eliminating the other, quite literally, quite physically, quite materially. And they also, for the British people, for the English people, for the English kings, they served as attempts at colonization, and they were largely unsuccessful. And historically speaking, Great Britain has always been, and England, it has always been unsuccessful in attempts to spread eastwards. It was redirected with the discovery of America in 1492. Inače, ovo otkriće Amerike, 1490, otkriće pod, I'm using air quotes, ove otkriće Amerike, se koristi kao alternativna godina za utvrđivanje početka tog premodernog doba. Znači, imamo proper medieval period, koji se završava ili se završava, znači, 1492. ili se završava sa Battle of Bosworth, 1485. Ali su to te dve godine koje se uzimaju kao, mislim, baš i pad Konstantinopolja, nisam sigurna. To isto, znači, neki 15. vek, tu su negde te godine. I to su godine koje se uzimaju kao kraj pravog srednjovekovnog ili premodernog perioda, i onda od tada, od 15. veka, od Tudora, kraljice Elizabete, Henrija i ostalo, znači tada ide nešto što se zove early modern period, pa onda imamo naravno onaj proper modernity, ako se sećate, od Francuske revolucije pa nadalje. Eto, čisto sam to htela da vam kažem, taj datum, 1492. So when America was, again, using air quotes, when America was discovered in 1492, the British, the English nation, the English rulers directed their attention to the West, and they were conquering continents lying westward of the British Isles, ever since. Again, that's one way of seeing it, because you also need to bear in mind that it also conquered India and ruled India for well into the 20th century, and Australia and New Zealand, and so on and so forth. Now the Black Death as another important feature of this period, and the feature that, again, is relevant for literature ultimately. Everything that happens, I mean, literature cannot stay immune to that. Literature does not happen in isolation. So the Black Death, or Mors Nigra, which is again a Latin term, but it was not the term that was used at the time. It was used in the Victorian age, much later. It happened during the reign of Edward III, so it lasted from 1346 to 1353. As you can see, pandemics last. So this one lasted for 7 years. And during it happened during the reign of Edward III, and it was known while it was happening. It was known simply as the Plague and Black Death in 1823, so in the 19th century. And it decimated the population. Approximately 30 to 60% of European population died, and it killed basically 75 to 200 million people in Europe and Asia combined. 75 to 200 million people in just 7 years. What caused the plague? Well, there are very many interpretations, and then who was guilty for the plague. But as many things in the medieval period, you can pin this rather safely to the church as well. How? The church you know, the church theology and then Christian theology, Christian doctrine, Christian dogma, and so on. It leans heavily on Plato, and it despises the material world, it despises the natural world, it despises the human body, despises the animals, and so on. It despises women. So the church was, throughout the medieval period, it encouraged hatred towards the cats, and cats were seen as the devil's animals, and the devils, like some, you know, helpers or whatever, devil's little helpers. So they had very negative, you know, associations. So the church stimulated that hatred, and there was a fun activity for the medieval, you know, people, peasants, and even higher classes to gather very many cats in one big sack, and to put the sack on fire. So cats were being destroyed, and then when the rats came on the ships from Asia, from the east, rats carried with them fleas, which carried the bacteria that causes the plague. And there were no cats to control the rat population, to cull the rat population. And as the result, you had people infected. It spread very easily. The contamination period lasted just a day or two, and then you had the infection, and this period also lasted for a day or two or three. So very, very short period, and people would die very soon. So as I said, 75 to 200 million people ultimately died, and the world population did not recover to pre-plague levels for a very long time. It was only in the 17th century when those levels were reached. So just think about it. This is something that is happening in the 14th century, and then you have 3 more centuries with people being born and being born and being born and still being unable to reach those population levels. And the plague, obviously, I mean, the plague never goes away, you know that. Ne znam da se sećate preprošle godine, kad je par u Mongoliji valjda boleo zato što su jeli neku životinju, a čitala sam i članak kako su u Njujorku, čini mi se, baš obrazovani Amerikanci, ne znam kako su se zarazili, ali ona je pričala, od toga može da se preživi sada, ali uz jedno teško lečenje. I ona je žena pričala, kaže, sada sam razumela srednjovekovnu književnost, jer kaže, vi zaista, to je takva vrsta bolesti koja ne deluje samo fizički, nego, kaže, to je toliko psihički opresivno. Ja sam, kaže, zaista imala a sense of doom, zaista sam, kaže, imala neke vizije apokaliptične, zaista imate, kaže, utisak kao da se približava smak sveta. A recimo njen partner koji se takođe zarazio, ona je prošla tako preživela, ali njen partner je, recimo, amputirane su mu noge, zato što to uopšte nije naivna bolest, znači ta bakterija dalje postoji, uvek postoji, samo znači nekad se desi taj outbreak, nekad ne. I oni su, znači, nastavili su the plague recurred as outbreaks until the 19th century, and now even in the 21st century it occasionally happens, but it is immediately contained, hopefully. It is contained. So the key thing is, don't kill cats. Don't, feed them. They are. I hate defending animals on the basis of their utility, but they are actually incredibly useful. They're incredibly useful. And it was incredibly stupid of the church. I mean, the church stimulated the hatred of cats because cats are traditionally associated with women, not only with the devil, but they're also traditionally. And literally, I mean, women kept cats. They're traditionally associated with women. They're traditionally associated with witches, and so on. They're mysterious. They're not obedient. That's the problem, and so on. So as a result, innocent cats were killed, and then innocent people also died because of some stupid ideology and some stupid politics. Anyway, the one of the more interesting details, I mean, those are gruesome statistics and gruesome facts, gruesome pieces of information. More important, more interesting details. These are modern costumes, but they represent actually the modern takes on the plague doctors from the medieval period. Now these are proper medieval illustrations, and they are actually plague doctors. and this is how they fought. I mean, it is not simply, it was not taken passively. I mean, there's a plague and we shall all die and so on. So they tried to apply whatever little knowledge they had to the plague and to those victims. The dominant theory was the so-called miasma theory and the theory of evil spirits. So there was the notion that it is bad air that causes plague. So these doctors had these bird-like masks that were filled with aromatic herbs and flowers, which were meant to purify the air they were breathing. And there were also fires that were burnt in public spaces to clear the air. The mask also had another function, and that was, of course, to ward the evil spirits, which was another theory of the causes of the plague. And you also had these red glasses where eyes should be in the mask, because that was also meant to ward the evil eye or these evil spirits. And they also carried sticks. I don't know if it is seen here. Yes, they carried sticks in order to examine the patients from afar. Dakle, vi imate ono pravilo sad, distanca od 2 metra, dobro, nije baš 2 metra, ali imate pravilo distance, znači 14. vek. I kuga. Dakle, neke stvari su radili instinktivno, prosto nisu prilazili i oni su sami potpisali, so they signed contracts that they would not treat other patients. So they were exclusively plague doctors. They would not treat other patients because they also instinctively knew that it was a bad idea, that they would perhaps, carry the disease to other patients as well. And this particular cloth, this is a wax cloth, so it is impregnated. It does not absorb liquids. And it is the early version of the hazmat suit, for instance. It is the early version of that sterile suit. And they also they were watched by custodians. So if they showed any signs of the disease, they would be eliminated. They would be removed from the contact with people. So these are all actually early versions of containment protocols with which, unfortunately, we too are by now quite familiar with. And it's very nice because it sheds light on the medieval medicine, which is a mix of superstition, but also science and also some clear logical thinking. And that is indeed typical of the Middle Ages. However, there were other consequences of the Black Death, not merely as if this huge loss of lives was not enough. There were other consequences, and they were social and, of course, political. And again, perhaps we can draw parallels, perhaps not. But there was growing fanaticism, there was growing racism, and downright murders that were stimulated by the fear of the disease, that were stimulated by the fear of the plague. So you have an increase in religious fervor. And the best example is the sect called the Flagellants in Germany, who would go through the streets in medieval cities in Germany, in medieval towns, half naked, whipping themselves because they thought, flagellants, whipping themselves because they thought that the God is punishing people for something that they did, for their sins, and they wanted very much to stay alive. So they were out in the open, openly punishing themselves so that they would be spared. And you can imagine, I mean, all those open wounds, all that blood, the droplets of blood, and so on. You can imagine how horrifically infectious, actually, that was. Then you also have certain groups that were targeted, like Jews, like friars, who were universally hated. You will see that friars are satirized in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Foreigners, beggars, pilgrims, lepers, and Romani people, of course. Romani people and Jews. They will be targeted by Hitler in the 20th century, and already in the 14th century, they are targeted by Europeans. They were blamed for the plague. People who had skin diseases, people who suffered from leprosy, psoriasis, acne, and so on, they were exterminated, singled out and exterminated. Dakle, nije bila marginalizacija društvena ili tako nešto, znači ovo je do teme jer je bilo jezivo. Dakle, oni su ubijani, tako da znači u taj broj žrtava od kuge treba da se ubroje i takve žrtve. So there's basically, I mean, what we're talking about is one of the consequences of the plague is medieval anti-Semitism, which is fueled by the fear of the disease. And this period, you have many attacks against the Jewish communities that are recorded, and they happened in France. They happened in well, surprisingly, Germany. So in February 1349, citizens of Strasbourg murdered 2,000 Jews, citizens. So you become a killer because the fear is so great, because you need someone to blame. Just think about it. Znači, to mi je najjeziviji deo i kako je počela ova naša pandemija i ostalo, znači uvijek mi je najjeziviji deo taj strah i ta histerija, samo da se ne pretvori u to, tako da moramo svi da vodimo dosta računa o tome. In August 1349, Jewish communities in Mainz and Cologne were annihilated. By 1351, 60 major, 150 smaller Jewish communities had been destroyed. What happened? The Jews moved to Poland, and what happened next? You have the map of the spreading of the plague. This is the plague-free zone. This is the plague-free zone. So this sounds like some kind of, again, poetic justice or heavenly reward for the Polish people who accepted the Jews. However, there's another explanation, that is they simply had better hygiene. They simply had better hygiene. And in Italy, in Milan, for instance, this is Milan. Milan is also a plague-free zone. It was a plague-free zone. How was this achieved? Milan survived by quarantining its city, burning down the house of anyone showing early symptoms with the entire family inside it. So just think about how extreme that is. Horrific, but zero plague. And Poland was untouched because it accepted the Jewish refugees, and they had a certain blood type. According to modern interpretations, they had a certain blood type that was particularly well suited to survive the plague, and also they had better hygiene. And this is an artistic depiction of the Black Death in England, and as you can see, it very nicely depicts the devastation of the natural world, the devastation of the human beings, but because these human beings also live in the society, you have the society which is on the brink of collapsing. While it lasted, it was horrific. However, there were some positive outcomes for those who survived, obviously. It left the mark in European literature. Boccaccio, for instance, wrote about it, Decameron, jel tako, to je upravo priča o ljudima koji se sklanjaju od kuge i pričaju priče. In England, you do not have much of that plague literature, so to speak, left. And the plague primarily affected the economy, and it resulted in the changed social landscape. You had, for instance, the 100 Years' War that was suspended at one point because there was high mortality among the soldiers. When those mortality rates dropped, when the plague passed, the war was restarted because now the soldiers had to die, but not from the plague. Labor was in great demand, and this led people, because now you could not find workers so easily. There was not so many people left. So the laborers, for the first time, could ask for higher wages. They could ask for less exploitation, for more freedom, and so on. And it is here, in the Black Death aftermath, that you actually see the full implications of Magna Carta, and that is the birth of the new class of the free farmers, and ultimately the death of serfdom. By the way, da li znate kada je recimo kmetstvo, kada je kmetstvo abolished recimo u Rusiji? Tek, ja mislim, u 19. veku, 1860 i neke, ako se ne varam. Ili je čak trebalo, ili se čak samo razmatralo tada. Znači, Rusija, ali dobro, to nije Evropa. The final characteristic, or the final, crucial event a landmark of this particular period is the Great Uprising, or the Peasant Rebellion, the Peasant Revolt of 1381. It was initiated against Richard II, who tried to increase the poll tax for the third time in that particular year, and people were so tired. And the poll taxes are particularly painful for people because they were head taxes paid equally by everyone regardless of income. So regardless of whether you were rich or poor, you had to pay that tax, and that tax was raised already 2 times, and then he tried to raise it for the third time in 1381. And the people revolted, which is not surprising. This is happening in 1381. This is happening in that changed social landscape after the Black Death, marked by labor shortage and people demanding their rights. And the origins of the rebellion were rural, but not all the participants. It's called the Peasant Revolt, but not all the participants were peasants. They included small landowner, tenant farmers, craftsmen, lower clergy who were dissatisfied with the lavish and extravagant life of the higher church officials, and so on. Now these rebels moved through the countryside, breaking into houses of officials and burning documents, which is brilliant. And they were chanting this particular lines: when Adam delved, meaning when he dug, and Eve span, who was then a gentleman? So this is what happens when you expose people to the Bible in their native language. They learn things, and they learn to demand equality and justice, because that is what Christianity is ultimately all about. So they resorted to these biblical figures, first human beings, in order to call attention to the fact that originally there was no social stratification, there were no social classes, and there was no inequality, material inequality, financial inequality, and so on. So they are basically, with this, they are calling out their authorities for deviating from the Bible, including church authorities. For some reasons, they killed also entrepreneurs in the wool trade from Flanders, and this is mentioned in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. And because I'm in a hurry, I would have to skip that, so we will not be reading it. They also burned down the palace of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, who you will hear a lot about when we start discussing Chaucer. He was also the father of the future King of England, Henry IV. He was extremely unpopular, so they burned down his palace, but he actually survived, whereas the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Treasurer were beheaded on Tower Hill as traitors to the country. So this was a very serious rebellion, a very serious revolt. It was led by Wat Tyler, by John Ball, who was a Lollard priest, and Lollards were John Wycliffe was one of them. They were quite radical. They hated the church. They hated icons. They were iconoclasts. They hated all those practices that were meant to establish the church's power and mysticism in relation to ordinary people. So obviously one of them would be a leader of the Peasant Revolt, and Jack Straw, mentioned by Chaucer. Now, Wat Tyler was the first one to call for fair treatment of the English poor, and he was very charismatic, so he was followed by the masses, but he lacked any kind of experience with the aristocracy, with the king, so he could not imagine that the king would actually betray him after agreeing to meet him and to discuss terms, to discuss requests, and so on. So the young king, of course, betrayed Wat Tyler and had him killed. He did not want to dirty his own hands. He had him killed. This is Richard II. He was incredibly young. I think he was a teenager when he sat on the on the throne, and you know what teenagers are like. So this is another depiction. This one is a medieval illustration, the murder of Wat Tyler. He rode to meet Richard II, and then he was murdered upon king's orders. What is interesting about this is that you actually have, unlike the plague, you actually have literature of protest, and that is how the whole historical account has been reconstructed, actually. Most of what is known about the rebellion, however, comes from those who were literate, those who kept chronicles, and they were, of course, members of the church, and of course they were horrified by the behavior of the rebels. And Henry Knighton, for instance, Thomas Walsingham, wrote about the uprising with deep shock, with outrage, and so on. They wrote in Latin. And you also learn about the rebellion from legal records, from judicial records, from the trials of the rebels, the trials to which these rebels were put. And the rebels' own voices, because these are, the chronicles were written by people who were firmly, like John Gower, also great moralist Gower, a satirist, they were all educated, well-off, wealthy people, and of course they were shocked by the behavior, because the behavior of the peasants ultimately destroyed the notion that the three states live in harmony and in unity and so on, and it smashed the illusion that these people were happy with their condition and that they were incapable of organized revolt. So it was quite shocking to them to learn that their own privileged position was quite fragile. The rebels' own voices, however, survive only in a series of cryptic utterances. And interestingly enough, even though these chronicles were written in English, in Latin, these the voices of the rebels are heard in English, cryptic utterances in English, but they are not necessarily very clear. So, for instance, you have several of the slogans that are found in sermon literature, which predates the rebellion. So, sermon literature that was energized by the translation of the Bible into English by John Wycliffe. So, for instance, the slogan is what? John the Miller has you ground small, small, small. The King of Heaven's Son shall pay for all. Beware ere ye be woe. Know your friend from your foe. Have enough and say ho. And this is quoted in Thomas Walsingham's Chronicles of England. And what I can gather, because it is utterly mysterious, what I can gather from this slogan, from this exclamation, is that people have had enough and they had to say ho, which means stop. And they relied on on Heaven's Son, on Jesus to pay for all. So in a way, they got courage from Jesus and from his example. Once again, this is why the Roman Catholic Church conducted all its rites in Latin, which ordinary people did not speak, in order to mystify them and in order to remove ordinary people as much as possible from the sources, from the literary sources, meaning the Gospels and the Bible, because the literary sources are quite explosive. They can radicalize you. And they are also interesting, the behavior of the rebels, and it is also interesting because there were letters or manifestos posted by the rebels in public places. For example, on church doors. To je tradicija koju će kasnije, znači ovdje stoji vam ovdje, it will be utilized by Martin Luther. U 16. veku Martin Luther će to koristiti takođe, njegove čuvene teze, i tako kreće reformacija, u stvari, koja je još gora, jer oni su imali tu dobru ideju da reformišu crkvu koja je bila ogrezla u raskošu i u tom bahatom životu nekom i u bahanalijama, ali ono što je proizašlo iz reformacije, to je jezivo. Međutim, ovde, znači ovo je mnogo ranije, 1381. Znači koristili su to ovi rebels, ali su to uzeli i mnogo ranije, mnogo pre toga koristili lollards, odnosno ovi odmetnuti lollards, oni su praktično proto-reformacioni pokret, znači oni su takođe bili već, znači u 13. u 14. veku oni su već bili protiv tog raskošnog života crkve i oni su prvi tako kačili svoje complaints i svoje predloge na vrata tih javnih zgrada, obično crkava i tako dalje, ali ovo takođe je poznati detalj iz znači istorije Evrope, to morate da znate, to će naravno i Englesku da zadesi, znači 95 teza, 95 thesis, koje je Martin Luther zakucao na vrata crkve 1517. i time započeo taj proces reformacije koji je rezultirao znači protestantskom branšom i znači mnogim drugim, ali pre svega progonom neistomišljenika jeziva. To je što se tiče dakle ovog uvoda. Poslala sam novi reader, u četvrtak ćemo čitat ćemo Perfect History i čitat ćemo History of the Deeds Done Beyond the Sea. Vidjet ćemo, možda ću nešto i da dodatno spremim, ali ne bih vas nešto previše opterećivao. We'll see. If we have any time left, we'll cover some additional material as well. Ali to ću vam doneti na vreme, tako da ne morate da brinete. Ovo je bilo nešto kraće, ali dobro, žurila sam se iz straha, ovo mi je jako dugo predavanje, žurila sam iz straha da ne i propustim nešto i da ne produžavam do četvrtka, tako da, ok. I hope that you could follow. Slobodni ste sada, ako nemate nikakve pitanja, slobodni ste, pa se vidimo u četvrtak.
Ja pitanje što se tiče kolokvijuma, računa ste pregledali neke testove, kako vam se čini za sada?
Pa pošto nisam pričala o kolokvijumu, valjda možete da izvučete neki zaključak.
Dobro.
Odlično, znači pametni ste, izvukli ste zaključak. Ok. Vidimo se u četvrtak. Prijetno.
Doviđenja.
Doviđenja.
Doviđenja.